The spring evening felt like winter had never left as I curled into the well-worn couch of our dimly lit living room. My husband stepped into the room, 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream in hand as he sat beside me and leaned against my shoulder. I pressed back, enjoying the momentary warmth as I took one of the mugs and sipped. A shriek speared its way into the cozy moment as my daughter of 15 sprinted down the hallway, through the kitchen, and into the living room, her feet barely keeping her up as she slipped along the wooden floor in her socks. Her eyes locked with ours briefly before she ducked behind the armchair in the corner. It took me a moment to register that my husband had left my side and was now in the kitchen. He returned to the doorway with a knife, his gaze casting down the hallway as he spoke. "Lindsay, what did you see?" Her head appeared momentarily from behind the chair. Even in the dim light, I could see the faint shimmer along her cheeks. Her breath barely managed to make it past her lips, but in the silence of the room, it carried just enough for Jack to hear.
"There's a naked man without a face in the closet."
Jack paused, almost for too long, before making his way down the hallway with the knife. I sat frozen, my heart throbbing painfully in my chest as my uncertain body tensed, ready for fighting. A minute passed, then 2. I heard the closet door open again with a faint creak before it was shut. Footsteps, tapping. My husband emerged from the hallway, expression unreadable as he approached Lindsay. Without a word, he sat the knife down and got on the floor beside her, pulling her into a secure hug. She clung to him, almost choking him as she held on with every ounce of fear. The quiet exchange hung in the air for several minutes. The hot chocolates had been forgotten, but now Jack was offering his to Lindsay. He tossed a blanket around her shoulders, scooping her up as if she were weightless and setting her down in the armchair. She curled into it tightly, willing herself to be as invisible as possible while she sipped at the warm drink between shaky breaths. I glanced down the hallway every other moment, curious but afraid. Jack knew what it was, otherwise he wouldn't be here with the knife set aside. It wasn't a threat, but what else would it possibly be? Jack waited, soothing Lindsay's hair until he watched her lashes fall against her cheek, a sigh escaping her lips. He snagged the mug from her and carried it to the kitchen. I stood and grabbed the knife, following behind him. "What was it?" I whispered as I returned the blade to the knife block off to the side of the stove. He sighed, raising his hands against the counter as he thought. I watched as he struggled with his reply. "Honey, there was nothing there." My brows furrowed, eyes searching his for uncertainty or lies. I found none. But I looked in the closet, in all of the bedrooms, the other closets, everywhere. There was nobody. His fingers curled into fists, pressing further onto the counter. A man without a face? That night, I slept in the living room with Lindsay. She was too afraid to go anywhere near the hallway closet by her bedroom door, and I felt waves of guilt for having done nothing during the whole incident. Having seen Lindsay as scared as she was, it was physically painful, and I had done nothing. The least I could do was help her feel safe in her own home. Jack decided to stay in the bedroom. It had already been late when the incident had happened, and the early morning shift made staying up with me unwise. I watched a nature documentary as I laid back, attempting to will myself to sleep as my eyes occasionally drifted to Lindsay. It wasn't long before the quiet mumbling of the TV lulled me to sleep. I woke to the sound of laughter. Opening my eyes, I searched the room without moving as I attempted to get my bearings. There was a brief moment of confusion as my groggy mind failed to recognize the atypical environment for me to awaken, but I quickly realized it was just the living room. My eyes landed on Lindsay, who had moved from the armchair to the corner itself. She sat, mumbling quietly to thin air. I almost asked who she was talking to, but decided against it. A quick scan of the room revealed that nobody was there but her and me. Bumps crept its way onto my skin as I fought to keep my breathing calm and even, listening intently to decipher what I could from the one-sided conversation. "There's a graveyard?" Past my lashes, I could see her shift, growing intrigued. "You promise?" I tried to think of a time I may have accidentally talked about the graveyard in front of Lindsay, but I couldn't remember any. The abandoned cemetery behind the house was obscured from view, so chances of her finding it by accident was next to none. The way to get there was overrun with dangerous obstacles and buried in a swampy, treacherous wasteland, so I made a point to not alert her of its existence. After Lindsay grew too quiet for me to hear for several minutes, I made a show of stirring. I swung my legs off the couch and sat up, the immediate pang of a previously dull headache setting in. Pinching the bridge of my nose, I glanced briefly at Lindsay before getting up and making my way to the bathroom, searching for some pain relief. My distracted thoughts tried to come up with a way to initiate a conversation with my daughter. I didn't want her to distrust me for listening in on her. Something was clearly wrong, and ignoring it would only make it worse. When I finally found the painkillers and made it back to the living room, however, Lindsay was already gone. I made my way quietly to her bedroom, peeking in just enough to see her figure on the bed in a cocoon of blankets. She didn't stir when the opening door creaked slightly. When I closed the door, my eyes caught sight of the windows in the living room. Faint touches of sunlight was just beginning to creep its way into the room in the early morning. I guessed it was only about 5 a.m. With a sigh, I headed to the master bedroom and crawled into bed with Jack, his half-asleep figure immediately pulling me into a comforting embrace. I knew that he was getting up soon, but I didn't want the small moment to end. For that brief time, it felt like everything was fine in the world. I woke with a start, unaware where I was or what time it was. Sitting up, I gathered that I was in my bedroom and that I was now alone. A note on the nightstand in Jack's handwriting wrote, "Get some sleep. You need it." I smiled, sitting the note back down and getting up. The wooden floor was cold beneath my toes as I stepped out into the hallway, immediately stopping to listen to a sound coming from the backyard. The sound of groaning wood followed dull thuds, and it was not hard to guess who was making the sound. I bolted for the back door, throwing it open. Lindsay's chocolate curls swung wildly as she attempted to hike over the palisade. Her hands were already at the top as she stood on the support beam about midway up the fence. My bare feet were carrying me through the grass before I even registered what was moving. "Lindsay, get down from there!" She spun her head around to look at me, body shifting just the right way to throw her off balance. One foot slipped off the beam, and she was suddenly dangling. She cried out as her hands gripped the splintery wood. "Just let go, you're not that far off the ground." With a dull thud, she landed in the damp soil. Her eyes fell on me one more time, an unfamiliar rage in them as she silently made her way inside. I wanted to lecture her, to stop her and talk to her about what was going on, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I went inside. We stood at the kitchen counter as I slowly plucked splinter after splinter from her bleeding hands. Her eyes stared directly at me, but not once did she see me. I called Jack on his way home. It was hard for me to think of how to bring up the topic, but after closing myself into the bedroom and dropping to a whisper, I recounted the events from this morning. He was as disturbed as me when he heard not only what she did, but how she reacted. We agreed that it was time to look to medical professionals. Once I got off the phone with my husband, I quickly made a call to the family doctor, who directed me to a psychiatrist after I did some explaining. I called the psychiatrist and scheduled an appointment for tomorrow. Dinner was exceedingly tense. Jack and I watched Lindsay a little more than we probably should have, stealing glances when we could, but not much was made in terms of conversation. There were a few times when one of us would try to start up a conversation, but Lindsay made no contribution, and each attempt died shortly after it started. Through the evening, her eyes would drift to a space between Jack and I, locked in what seemed to be a trance. The next morning couldn't get here fast enough. When it finally did, the sun was buried behind bleak clouds that cast the world into sickly tones. There were signs of a morning shower having already passed, another shortly underway. When we left to go to the appointment, the air was chilly and damp as it clung to my skin before we piled into the Jeep. Driving to the hospital was torturously slow. Lindsay knew we were going to a doctor's appointment, but she simply thought it was a routine appointment that I forgot to remind her about. The questioning didn't begin until Jack turned in the opposite direction we usually went to get to the family doctor. "I thought we were going to the doctor's." My breath caught as the question hung in the air. "Where are we really going?" "To see a psychiatrist, Lindsay." Jack's voice caught me off guard. I looked over to him, half grateful for his unwavering support, half wincing in anticipation for backlash. Lindsay was quiet for a moment. I waited for yelling, for swearing even, but when she did finally speak again, it was barely loud enough to reach my ears. "Why?" "I'm not that kind of person. I'm not that kind of person." "There's no specific type of person you need to be to go to a psychiatrist, Lindsay." Jack sighed, and I noticed his fingers clenching the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I took the opportunity to give him a break from being the bad guy. "Sunshine, your dad and I are just worried." I felt the tears in my eyes, but didn't wipe them away. Instead, I stared at the road so Lindsay wouldn't notice. "You haven't been yourself, and you've been seeing things that aren't there." There was a thickness to the air not unlike a brewing storm. It was obvious there was a mountain of things that Lindsay wanted to say, but no replies were made. I wondered, half grateful, if she was silently agreeing, or if she simply gave up on the idea of convincing us that she was fine. Whatever was wrong, I wanted to help her, to save her from whatever nightmare she was creating for herself. All I could hope was that what was wrong was curable. "You said that nobody in the family has a history of hallucinations?" Dr. Hawk asked while Lindsay was in another room getting drug tested. Jack and I both nodded before we launched into a more detailed recount of the past couple of days. The doctor only paused us long enough to ask a few questions before letting us resume. When we finished, he promptly nodded before writing some of the things down in Lindsay's file. "Well, I can't exactly tell you what the matter is yet, but if the drug tests all come back clean, we can run an MRI scan to make sure that there's no physical ailments before we begin psychological assessment." He scanned through Lindsay's file for a moment before closing the folder. "Either way, we plan to get to the bottom of this, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson." Much of the month was a similar process as the first day. After the drug test came back clean, Lindsay was subjected to an MRI scan that ruled out tumors as a potential cause. The next several months were focused on psychological analysis and therapy to help manage her symptoms until they could better pinpoint the matter. My personal research came back with haunting answers that left me knowing more than I ever cared to about various mental disorders. When the diagnosis finally came to be, Jack was the only one who spoke to the doctor about possible treatment methods, but I had never felt so hollow. They were all temporary fixes, not even guaranteed to work. My daughter couldn't be saved. I sat next to Lindsay in the back seat on the way home that day. Our relationship had taken a somewhat sour turn since we had started taking her to the hospital, but she didn't pull away as I held her hand and rubbed her arm distractedly. She was such a smart, beautiful girl. Why did it have to be her? As the Jeep pulled into the driveway, I noticed Lindsay had fallen asleep, so Jack had to carry her inside. I watched with red, sore eyes as he laid her down and tucked her in as if she were 8 again. So little has changed over the years, and yet when I look back, everything has. He kissed her forehead before standing to leave the room. Just before we swung the door shut, Lindsay stirred in her bed, sitting up slightly. "Mom? Dad?" We both paused, silently debating which of us should reply. When Jack hesitated, I decided to do so. "Yes, sweetie?" I know you both want me to get better, but I don't want to go back there anymore. She cleared her throat, changing the subject. Do you think it's possible for people to fly without planes or helicopters? If there's a way for that to happen. She didn't finish her sentence, but she didn't have to. Without some type of help? No, unfortunately. She had already laid back down, seemingly satisfied with the exchange. I slipped my hand into Jack's and gently tugged him out of the room, the door quietly falling shut behind him. I didn't get much sleep that night. Each time I drifted off, my imagination got the better of me. Lists of symptoms, the white walls of the hospital, the words of the doctor, the nightmare that has become this family's everyday. Lindsay wasn't the only one struggling with mental health anymore. I didn't remember falling asleep, but my eyes fluttered open as the gentle rubbing over my cheek pulled me from my rest. The room was still dimly lit, but tiny fragments of light slipped through the curtains, lighting the room just enough for me to see Jack's face. He pulled me into a groggy kiss and traced his fingers over my back. Sighing against his lips, I had a hard time being worried in what felt like years. Today was a Monday, so Jack had to leave for work soon. I enjoyed a few minutes of cuddling with him before he finally got ready. When he showered, I went to go make breakfast for everyone. Once I made the pancakes up, I divided them evenly onto 3 plates and then went to go get Lindsay. As I passed the bedroom, I could hear Jack getting dressed. I knocked softly on her bedroom door, already twisting the knob before I'd gotten a reply. "Good morning, sunshine." The words died on my lips as I peered into the room at the sight of an empty bed. It had been neatly made, an unusual gesture for Lindsay, but nothing else had otherwise been out of the ordinary. Confused, I searched the other rooms in the house, only to find them just as vacant. It only dawned on me, perhaps later than it should have, to check the backyard. The panic threatened to take control as the bubbling anxiety gripped me. I made my way to the back door and tore it open, ignoring Jack's confused voice as he called my name from down the hall. Beelining it to the fence, I knew there was only one spot where she would have actually been able to get over. When I got to the section that was shorter than the rest of the fence, however, there was no evidence that anyone had been there. The squishy earth lay untouched. "Maddie!" Whirling round, I saw Jack in the doorway. His face was that of confusion as he looked at me, hair sticking up at odd angles from his rush to investigate. "What are you doing?" Approaching him, I allowed the faintest bit of fear edge into my voice. Lindsay. She wasn't in her room, Jack." Silence. His mouth gaped as he searched for the words, but nothing came. After a moment, he gave up and turned to head back into the house, presumably to look for Lindsay. I was almost onto the deck when something caught my eye off to the side of the yard. A small, awkward lump lay beside the house, way back in the corner that rarely sees sunlight. I couldn't tell what it was for certain, but my blood became burning ice beneath my skin as the worst-case scenario played in my head. I almost wish I didn't go and investigate. Sure, it wouldn't have changed anything, but I was not prepared, and almost anything would have been better. It was impossible to see past the tears, impossible to even breathe properly. My body racked with sobs so heavy that every inch of my being seemed to vibrate. There was a scream, but it took me a moment to realize that it was me making the sound. Her body contorted like a dropped and forgotten marionette, all of the strings of life plucked from her figure. Beside her, halfway under her arm, was a drawing of a silhouette against the purple sky, the words, "Let me fly because my family tells me I can't," written beneath it. The living nightmare that stole my daughter from me took more than just my daughter. Why did it have to be schizophrenia?